Many studies by scientists, PhD students, and scholars have concluded that gameplay toxicity is attributed to the rise of competitiveness in video games. There are many factors at play, and today we'll dive headfirst into this discussion. Since the beginning of time, man has competed against our fellow man. The history of competition can trace its roots far back, much farther than human beings. Before evolution, before primitive cave species and dinosaurs, and even further back, to tiny microscopic organisms living in cells of things too small for us to see, even with a microscope. What do they all have in common? Competition. Food is scarce, water is scarce too. Space closes in on one's habitat over time as populations grow and resources become ever diminishing. A lack of resources push creatures to fight one another due to the constraints of limited resources and territory. The strong survive and the weak perish. Fast forward to today. The rise of popularity of competitive online games, such as first-person shooters and MOBAs, brings out our animal instincts of competition. People fight, they rage amongst themselves and their peers, and don't have a problem throwing pejoratives and foul names at each other like candy on Halloween night. Today's discussions will focus on 3 triggers of player toxicity and how changes in competitive play have taken player behavior to such an unnerving state. Before we jump into each point, where is the target issue with toxicity? It exists in competitive games, peer-to-peer games, PvP as we call them, progressively competitive games. Not surprisingly and often overlooked, challenging offline games, player versus environment, or artificial intelligence, don't bring out people's evil. It's only when the existence of another human being factors into the equation that people become toxic and spread hate. Our DNA reminds us that we need to compete with others and be the best. It's so deeply ingrained in our biological code of a human being. Those incapable of clicking the off switch in our brain are the people that are ruining competitive games today. Why is it worse than ever today, and what are the top 3 pain points? Let's start with number 1. Repercussions for being toxic have changed. Changes in game popularity have allowed toxicity to spread rampantly through competitive online games. Game popularity, which games we play, has shifted in the last few years. Let's take a look. Most online toxicity started back with MMOs, which were in our community-based games. Community-based games create barriers for toxic players because your peers don't disappear into the wind after you interact with them. You're going to run into repeat players frequently. In World of Warcraft, you had to work with each other. It's a community, and it had a set population. You were a permanent resident in a bigger world. You couldn't get away with being a dick. Rage on someone now, and 3 weeks later, you might not be able to get into that Karazhan run. Think about the popular games today: League of Legends, Dota, Overwatch, Call of Duty. It's not World of Warcraft anymore players are latching onto. That time has passed and traditional MMOs are a dying breed. Today's popular games are built with player isolation in mind. Researchers label these games easy in, easy out games. You play with a team for a while, or by yourself, and then you move on to the next one. It's quick and seamless. They are potential crime scenes for ragers and an absolutely perfect natural habitat for poisonous toxicity. It segregates us from others, and toxic players use this as a temporary recess to exploit other players without regret, knowing that they'll never see them again. It's easy to be toxic when you feel safe from recourse and responsibility. This effect is compounded as a game gets more players and becomes more densely populated, as it decreases the rate at which you will run into repeat players, thus incentivizing bad behavior. The more players, the more problems. Unfortunately, this also translates not just to your opponents but also your teammates as well. Team-focused games demand cooperation, and the disparities between a player A and a player B's skill level can fluctuate violently among any given match or game. Algorithms for matching players of like skill are hit or miss. and it's possible to end up on a team with someone far better or far worse than you in a lot of your games. However, in lies a greater problem. Toxicity is a desensitizer. When you're under the influence of toxicity, your judgment is impaired, and you can make yourself believe, you can convince yourself that your teammates are less skilled than you, and in turn are holding you back from winning that game. In your eyes, due to toxicity affecting your emotional state, your teammates are ruining your game and your time. It leads to players becoming resentful of each other, even though this can be conjured up completely without warrant, an illusion affecting the toxic player from behaving rationally. This leads to strife that extends far beyond any given match and into the community. Toxicity spreads past the game, way past the chat boxes we type in. It floods the online forums, it overturns community managers' email boxes, it dilutes support ticket systems, and it wastes development time. Developers have to spend millions of dollars implementing honors systems to incentivize good behavior and to punish those whom they know will plague the community with toxicity. Just look at the tribunal system from League of Legends, a multi-million-dollar courtroom simulator to stave off the invasion of toxicity. It's a wall that surrounds the castle on top of the mountain, desperately trying to keep some semblance of order for the core player base. Let's slide on down to number 2, the advancement of technology. For one, technology has brought great change in the last 20 years. 20 years ago, the only competition was meeting up with someone at a local arcade, stuffing a few quarters into it, and playing a few rounds of Mortal Kombat. Before that, we didn't have much to compete with. Leading up to that point, console games were generally meant for the solo player. Finding a great competitive 2-player game on the Nintendo was very difficult. Even more, finding the people to compete against was even harder. You had to be lucky enough if you had a friend in the local neighborhood who could ride his bike over and play a few hours with you. Today, this is not the case. The internet is everywhere and plugging in is instant. Ranked ladders and competitive modes are the fuel for a lot of online games. It builds attachment to games, that feeling of competition to a human. It is only in the last 10 years that we have built up this fervor with games. Rivalry is a powerful drug in gaming. Every year, more players connect, log in, and more people get access. When populations increase, the notion of having people compete for spotlight or compete to make ourselves stand out also increases in tandem. When density is added to a game, it becomes harder and harder to see other people succeed when you are not. It's a cycle that drives us to be more competitive and lowers our ability to remain rational and level-headed when we struggle through difficult losses. When we lose, it becomes harder to swallow watching the people stand above us. It reminds us that they're better than us. And knowing the history of the human genome, we know that humans will always strive to be the best. The sting of defeat hurts. Players who don't have a strong sense of self-discipline and respect go overboard at this point. It's never a pleasant sight watching someone belittle someone else, but it happens. Many of us have been there. We've said some things we shouldn't have. Those of us who learn from our mistakes become better people in the end. Technology has brought us to this point, and we are unaccustomed to having to remain neutral in times of defeat and competitive matches because up until this point, most of our gaming history has been in the peer-to-environment realm. Gaming populations are becoming more sticky these days as everyone gets access to competitive games through the advancement of technology. Let's shimmy down to number 3 and our final talking point. Competition is a surrogate for our own personal issues. Most people are surprised to find out that toxicity in games has nothing to do with the games themselves. People are unstable, and just like they can walk into work carrying baggage or dead weight from home, players bring unwanted, ill emotion in from their personal lives into video games. Toxic players are not happy with themselves, so they pretend to be happy with themselves by putting other people down. It makes them feel better about themselves and disguise their own personal issues. They use other players as signposts to mark their territory. They are looking for trouble because trouble is looking for them outside the game. It's possible that they aren't happy with their lives, more often than not, and when people aren't happy with their own current state of being, they're more apt to pursue conflict. Moreover, they are more easily agitated and primed for instigation. The smallest prick can set these people off because it reminds them that the greater problems outside the game, problems with themselves, exist, and they're waiting for them once they finish that game. Not all toxic players are like this, but many are. As for the rest of them, they will feel the impacts of what they do soon after they get up from that computer chair. Most of the time it's regret. The slimy feeling on your tongue, or that two-take of yourself in the mirror just because you don't like how you look. They feel it when we are gone, rest assured, yes they do, and it doesn't feel good for them. We've all been the recipient of a hateful comment while playing an online game, and some of us have been on the other side as well. Most of the time though, it's not personal. But why? Toxicity is directed through a keyboard at a name, not a person, but a computer screen. Once players start to understand that the raging 12-year-old is yelling at Timo and not Tony, it's easier for everybody to detach from the quarrel and just laugh it off. Then we realize that it's easier to blame your team than take responsibility. It grants the toxic player an avenue to be indefensible and lash out. That's all he's doing. Toxicity can never be stopped by anyone but the player. The player has to choose. They have to choose not to sit down in that chair and queue up. But they rarely do. There wouldn't be so many "what to do when you're raging in League of Legends" videos on YouTube if this wasn't the case. Tribunal and punishment systems keep toxic players at bay, but it doesn't keep them away.